This is a very beautiful and unusual piece. It's kind of a table song, like a toast. And the subject of the song is an actual historical figure who was alive during Stassinopoulos' own life, named Capitan Michalis Kourakis. Michalis Kourakis was a rebel chieftain leader of the Cretan uprising of 1897. And some decades later, the great novelist Nikos Kazantzakis wrote a book based on the life of Kourakis called Freedom or Death, or that's the translation that was given in America. And in that book, the grandson of the hero asks his mother, what was grandfather like? And she replies, well, he was like your father. He mostly smoked his pipe and gazed into the mountains when he wasn't killing Turks. So this is a piece of like rural, backwoods, right-wing, racist, saber-waving, blood-dripping enthusiasm, which is really one of my favorite vocal performances of all time, which I would say sort of forgives any of the kind of political problems that it contains necessarily. He's also a lauto player, this folk instrument, and he's a demon on that as well. So, Soterios Stassinopoulos, recorded again 1927, New York City.
τουρκικά κεφάλια πέρασαν από τη ζούμα
deeply proud man, I think it's safe to say. So I ended my project in 1929, and the reason was actually pretty simple. After 2 decades of more and more and more and more immigrant records being made in the United States, the stock market crash and the onset of the Great Depression forced the record labels to completely change their business models. And they basically decided to stop taking chances at all. Immigrant records were just mostly too difficult to figure out what was going to sell, what was going to make money, and what wasn't. Remember, a lot of the people who work at the record companies can't tell a good performance from a bad one. They really have no idea what they're working with in some cases. So the general policy was just like, yeah, no, unless you're really selling a lot of records, they just stopped recording people. And it ended the careers of hundreds and hundreds of musicians, on record at least. Stassinopoulos was one of those people. His records just immediately stop at the end of 1929. But being this deeply proud man, when you could start, it was easier to get access to recording gear and to pressing plants in the 1940s. There became this new wave, this new group of self-released records by immigrants. And Stassinopoulos started his own label with, on the label of the records themselves, there he is in full regalia and a big black waxed mustache with his hands akimbo like this, staring out at you like, yes, I am Super Stassinopoulos, here to save you and musically. And they're exactly like the stuff he was recording 20 years earlier. I mean, he's quite an old man by this point, and they're really great. Highly, highly recommend them if you should run into them. But this next song is actually the one that I had to not include. And I really went back and forth about whether to put this record on or not. The reason I wanted to put it on is because it's one of my favorite records ever. But it's the end of one thing and the beginning of something else. And it falls chronologically just after 29. It was recorded in 1931 by a guy whose Americanized name was Jack Gregory. Jack Gregory made his living exactly 2 ways his whole life. He was a bookie, he took bets, and he was a dope dealer. He sold hash. My favorite Jack Gregory story is talking with a buddy of mine who also likes him, and these rumors get shared back and forth. And he goes, "Do you know the story about the wallets?" "No. What about the wallets?" He goes, "Yeah, so the cops came in and busted him for selling weed. And they opened one closet door and they found this huge stack of empty wallets." I said, "Really? So he's a pickpocket too?" He goes, "Right, I know. Great, huh?" And so I met his son, Jack Gregory Jr. Now, this is a sensitive thing to bring up, Was your father a thief in the street? So I waited 5 minutes out of politeness, and then I asked him, and he said, "Gee, I don't know that story, but yeah, that sounds like Dad." He didn't need the money. He just really hated cops and squares. So he was a hobbyist pickpocket. Most of the Greek musicians that made records during the first decades of the 20th century were accompanied by instruments out of the Ottoman courts, basically. You kind of have violin and canoon, and or else they were recorded in Western pop style. In other words, like Italian type sound, mandolins and guitars. But there was another folk instrument that didn't get recorded very much until this record was made. There'd been a couple of bouzouki records before, but this was the first hit. It came at an important time, and it changed music forever. This record did. The bouzouki was profoundly disreputable for a long time. It was performed by people who were in jail or in hash dens getting stoned. It was not a polite sound. It was the sound of criminals, of an underworld of, dope smokers, toughs. And the reason it was a hit when it was released in Greece in 1932, and such a hit that it was recovered 6 times inside of 1 year, sold tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of copies worldwide, was that it spoke to a kind of new generation that had come up. So I said that Greece was in financial trouble and they were spending a lot of money on their military. When Greece won its independence in the beginning and middle of the 19th century, the territory that was Greece was about a third of the size of the current state of Greece. So they kept trying to kind of win territory from the Ottoman Empire. And during one of those campaigns in 1922, they were defeated. And the army marched down the coast of Anatolia to Smyrna, where they thought they might be able to get out relatively safely. They were wrong. The Ottoman military followed them. And one of the stories goes, the story that is circulated among some immigrants that I met, was that the soldiers, the Turkish soldiers, actually spent the night sort of drinking and partying and listening to music with the Greeks, as they had done in Smyrna for hundreds and hundreds of years. But in the morning, the call came to attack. Well, there's been a lot written about this situation, the Smyrna catastrophe, but the city burned for 2 weeks, and many, many thousands of people lost their lives. The British were supposedly on the side of the Greeks and had their boats stationed back in the harbor and watched all this happen, but didn't do anything for 2 weeks. People were swimming out to the British boats asking to be let on, to save themselves from the chaos, and they wouldn't let anybody on. And finally, after 2 weeks, they came up with a solution of sorts. Okay, Greece, you round up all your Muslims and ship them to Turkey. Turkey, you round up all your Greeks, ship them to Greece. So, in Greece, the port cities of Athens and Piraeus at the time had populations of about 250,000 each. And in the space of 2 weeks, the population of each nearly doubled. And all of these people, the population exchange, as it's rather politely referred to, these refugees from Anatolia who've come from educated backgrounds, who are fairly middle-class people by and large, are then assigned by the government in many cases a single sheet of corrugated steel that's arched over, under which they sleep, sometimes for years. And most of them were women and children and older folks, because a lot of the men were just killed outright. So this generation went through this tragedy, and a lot of them fell into the pre-existing underworld that any port city has, of gamblers and touts and pimps and hustlers, and watching the middle class, their countrymen, strutting around in their hats, going back and forth to work, to church, pretending to be Italian, sending the cops in, but never sending any money into the slums. Fuck you, people. The rage that boiled up out of the slums over the course of a decade became a kind of culture unto itself.